Chairman, we see that you all made a few changes in the House to this bill that deals with ambulances and the movement of patients from one facility to another. So I guess to begin with, we'll just start with, could you explain your changes and why those happened?
The changes in our consideration on the House floor, we had testimony from one representative and then a number of representatives that believe that the process for making these safe transfers did not need all of this extra regulatory process to accomplish it. And so those things were stricken from it to send back to you. And still to accomplish the task of providing safe transport for the patients and the process for the workers to be able to be confident in performing their tasks.
Yes, Senator Bowers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In your committee process, did you hear those concerns as you worked it in committee? Just curious.
We mostly spoke about the importance of accomplishing these tasks, and I think then those other concerns came up on the House floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Basically, the key presentation was on the variance going from a temporary to a permanent. And then when the variance, and most of us in the committee, that was kind of the way the supplemental note was written that way, coming from the Senate as well as revisers. So there was a lot of that detail that really wasn't brought up in the testimony. So consequently, it passed out of committee. I believe we had a couple of no votes within the committee. It wasn't unanimous. And then it got to our House floor, and we had one representative who has 17 years as experience as an EMT, volunteer fighter, and really those volunteer people cover 80% of Kansas. 80% of our cities are smaller cities. And so they felt that the problem that was cause of a shortage of EMTs and sufficient staffing was caused by overregulation with the board. And then when we really got to looking at it, this bill was totally, when it was amended, gives EMS board total authority over contract, gives them subpoena authority, the civil fine issues, and the ability to raise higher qualifications for EMS when they're already in short supply, and certainly the variance determination. So I think once we heard testimony from that person who actually had 17, 18 years experience working as an EMT and as a volunteer firefighter, that's when the amendment got on the floor, and it went through the floor out of the House 119-4 when we figured out what the real impact of that. So that's kind of the reason of what happened in committee. And I wrote the bill brief, on the House side, basically based on a lot of the supplemental note, which really indicated we were more on taking a variance that was tried in 5 cities as a pilot from a temporary status to grant that permanent, so they wouldn't have to come back every year because of the shortage. And most of the committee members and obviously House members as a vote figured that you need one person to drive, you need another certified EMT in the back. You don't necessarily need both. So,
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my understanding, when you talk about the things that were added in terms of fines, I understood that was current statute. So if you look at this, we're modifying, or the Senate was modifying 65611 just to add, I think on page 2, the lines 17 through 20. The rest of that is already in statute. And then, of course, there's some changes in section 2. But in section 1, I think that's current statute. So none of those fines are being added or changed.
So we're basically taking something that was already in current law out that had nothing to do with the bill. Because somebody who was an EMS person or whatever, or a fire, wanted those out. EMT wanted the regulations out because they were upset because they got in another year, not in this bill. They were part of current law. Did I understand that, Sarah Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think their current law, and it wouldn't be changed because we wouldn't then be modifying that section, but we wouldn't be making the change to the variance. But just want to be clear that those things are not new, they're in current statute.
Right, that's what I'm saying. That was already current statute that was removed. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. The original bill, the Senate bill that came from your chamber, didn't have all that laced into it, and we wondered why why it was added in. The original bill was a half a page long, and then it was modified to have all of that text added to it, and don't understand why that had to happen. Can we explain that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when so when we heard this bill, we heard two different concerns. You know, certainly from the communities that had the difficulty about ambulances and also EMS. So the idea of making a variance permanent was a compromise that had been reached between the parties. But to put that language in, then the bill and our revisor had to add 65611 because that was the appropriate place to add it. So that's my understanding, and we can ask our revisor to confirm that. But this was to reflect the compromise that was reached between the parties that testified before the Senate.
Yeah, between the EMS officials and the agency and the cities. Jason, did you have anything to clarify or just to make sure we're on track?
Madam Chair, the only thing I would clarify is just that the senator is correct. The only reason that this language appears in the Senate version of the bill is because the provisions in statute that govern how the EMS board can grant a variance needed to be amended to allow them to grant a permanent variance. And so that amendment appears, as you see on the Senate version of the bill on page 2 on lines 15 through 18. All the rest of the language on pages 1, 2, 3, and the top half of page 4 is all current law. Those are current statutory provisions that govern the duties, obligations, and responsibilities of the EMS board. The only amendment the Senate added to that was authorizing them to grant a permanent variance, and that permanent variance authorization is only granted for the provisions relating to qualifications for ambulance personnel under 65-6135. Any other variances the EMS board would wish to grant could only be temporary in nature. The only permanent variance, again, would be with respect to ambulance personnel qualifications, which are described under Section 2.
And so, Mr. Revisor, the verbiage was added in because of to reflect the permanent variance rather than the temporary.
That's correct.
So all this was already in fact, we went from a 3/4 of a page that apparently what you're saying, if I'm understanding right, had all these things according to the KSA statute, but yet they weren't listed other than under the statute. Am I interpreting that correct?
Yes, 65-6111 is current law, and it is a lengthy statute governing the EMS board's duties and obligations. And that statute, because our Constitution requires the full statute to be put into a bill in order to be amended, I had to bring in the full statute, even though there was only one provision of that statute being amended by the Senate committee.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Sarah Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A change that was made in the House Committee of the Whole, I'm understanding, was to add back in um, the limitation for requiring only emergency medical service in a city with a population of less than 50,000. And can you help us understand why that was something that you wanted to see back in the statute?
Yes, it was basically 80% of the services over that class 2 cities and below. So it felt like the rural areas would be impacted more by this restriction. And I think probably everybody in our side was operating on the fact that these amendments were new and putting in as opposed to the reading of it. So that was kind of the reason behind this situation. There is a strong push, and obviously the House sent a strong message with 119-4 on a vote to do this. So obviously there was more than one that might have been confused, but at the same token, I think there's a strong support to have those rural communities to be able to have some control, to be able to have certainly only one certified EMT under those 50,000 county and 50,000 cities, because most of those counties already have two and have the funds that can deal with that. So that was probably kind of the basic concern. Thank you.
Sarah Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have two concerns about that language and didn't have to worry about it after it was removed from our bill. But one is that we might want to say the board shall not require any vehicle providing emergency medical services based in a city with a population, so that you don't have any question if you're driving through another city. And then I'm not sure if this wording, minimum personnel required, could mean that you could just have that you wouldn't have to have both the driver and an EMT. You could just have a single person. And that also would cause some concern because we wouldn't want it, we would want both the driver and someone to be with a individual who's being transported, I would think. And so that's not clear in this language.
Yes, Madam Chair, I might answer. That driver would have to have the basic medical requirements, direct pressure, HIPAA, privilege, CPR, and all those. So, I mean, that was a push there that, not just to have a driver as a driver. And in addition, wouldn't have to be certified. That was kind of the push on that. So, thank you.
Feathers?
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to point out that I am one of the four that opposed this on the House. And with a little research, I know we're trying to help Western Kansas. I find 15 towns and cities in Johnson County alone that fall well under 50,000. So I'm afraid we might be ending up with a real mess in Johnson County. How are our ambulances going to get around? How are they going to get to Overland Park Regional in the middle of Overland Park from Spring Hill? So I really think we need to have the professionals in on these decisions.
And Senator Francisco mentioned where the service is based out of rather than what it transfers through, and I think that could assuage some of the problems that you're talking about.
All right. Well, I think the Senate's position at this time, being concerned about what the original intent was on the floor to strike, a lot of this language, which is now back in. Our concern is the way this language is drafted on page 436 to 40, that you could interpret that as only having one person in the ambulance. And so at this point in time, the Senate will take the Senate position.
We would like to come back to conference with you folks at yet another time. We're going to take our information back to more discussion and so we will agree to another conference.
Okay.
If I'll keep continuing.
Okay.
All right?
I think the rest of the day is starting to get all tied up, so would be all right if I get a hold of you tomorrow and you and I find where we have some free time and we'll try to get something scheduled.
What time? What's the earliest time you can talk? Not as a committee, but when can you
Visit with you?
Yeah.
Well, I want you guys to have the opportunity to discuss, so how about I give you a call in the morning
Sounds good.
and then we'll get something scheduled. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.